Sometimes we forget why we're here. It's easy to fall off track. These help us remember.
These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Growing up, I had a dream, something no one else could see. Tell me what it means when your faith is falling beneath your knees and you can't breathe. Everything you see reminds you of what you're not or something you won't be. You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they wanna do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shame. And that's the reason I'm staying up late, trying to find a way to escape the stereotypes. This day and age is making me feel like the only way I'll be happy is getting signed to a label and making money through rapping. I wanna share my emotion because this world is attacking the very principle of life that lets the people be happy. If you don't have a reason to breathe, why even live? These battle scars are impressions of everything that it is.
Don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Now, if I had a voice that reached 100 million people, I'd tell them there's a reason that we're all created equal. Cause some decide to be great and some decide a sequel to an average person's life is simply what they want to be. So you make your decision, all I know is what I'm given. Won't define the life I lead or the way I dwell in existence. I've seen a greater image on the walls of where I'm living, and the words twisted and scripted remind me of something written. Faith is a gift that is given down to the people. If one believes it, one receives it. It's given if it is needed. Don't ever think you're trapped in a life that you never wanted. Your options are infinite, that's some mathematical logic. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers and these battle scars on my church. Not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers, these battle scars on my church.
Scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're faded, don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Well, hello everyone. I hope you are doing well. Excuse me with my cough. Most of you have been watching for the past week. No, I've been sick. I did get a COVID test today because I was starting to wonder, was I mistaken? Not COVID, which makes me feel really good, not because I don't have COVID, but because I would have felt like a complete dirtbag if I had assumed I had a cold and was living my normal life and accidentally exposed friends, which thank God I did not. So it's a cold or the flu, but I never had a fever. I think it's just a cold. I was traveling a lot, been through a lot of stress. So that's probably what it is. So I'm sorry that my voice is not up to par. And it's not even like that sexy husky. It's like coughing, which is like the farthest from sexy there possibly could be. We do have a guest tonight. And as you know, I don't normally do a lot of guests, hopefully to do some in the future. So this is going to be a little bit of a guinea pig experience. But before we get to that, and hi, Joshua Ham, I do see you in chat. And as you know, all of my shows are very interactive, guests or not. I like comments. I like interacting with comments. It keeps things fresh. And let's do the necessaries before we bring on our guest. Along the bottom here is my Patreon. As you know, YouTube is now my part-time job. If you appreciate the type of content that I do, which I think is somewhat unusual, being pretty Libertarian Party specific politics, it is a very small niche. It's a niche. I found my niche, but it's a very small niche. And in order to enable this type of content to keep going, I do need your support. If you can, there's the link. Will not belabor that point. Also, anytime during chats, most of my content, even though this is a monetized YouTube channel, ads and political content just in general, most political content is deemed by YouTube to be not advertiser friendly. So super chats are always welcome. And in the low bar, there's all other kinds of ways of support, including an Amazon affiliate link, which does not cost you anything to use. If you hit that link, I think it brings up the Anarchist Handbook. But if you do all of your searches from there, there's the cookie that Amazon puts on your system. Any purchases you make during that session get credited to my affiliate account, and it costs you nothing. All right. I don't think I'm going to be able to put up the chat widget tonight because there won't be enough room on the screen, but we shall see. Let me pull the patron off. And Cade Hill says, hopefully it can become my full-time job. If I get the support, it can be. I would do multiple content a day. I'm already trying to do one a day, as you guys know, at least one, sometimes two. Okay, I'm terrible with names. So, Ramsey is our guest. I'm going to allow him to do his own introduction and pronounce his own last name because I will mangle it. And what we're talking about tonight is top two. I'll let him explain more what top two is. I have my own understanding, but perhaps it is flawed. He asked to come on the show because he had heard me speak negatively about top two in the past. And I think he's hoping to persuade me to have a more positive view. But even if not, it will be educational and he might persuade you. Or, you know, again, more knowledge is better about the political system that we're all having to live under. So let me find my guest screen here. I think it's right here. Well, I hope I didn't lose them. Hold on one second here. Where? Interview. There we go. Let's bring him on. Yay! I was able to do it. Don't hear you.
Yeah, it worked.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
You're not hearing me still?
No,
Okay,
now I
perfect.
am. Okay, it just seems like there's a little bit of a delay, but that's sometimes inevitable with the internet and streaming. So if you could do an introduction, and after the introduction, if you could just explain a bit about top two, and we'll enter our discussion.
Okay, sounds good. So my name is Ramsey Ramerman. I'm an attorney, been practicing for a couple decades. My general focus in law is on issues of transparency. I consider myself to be a libertarian, although I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party currently. We're talking today because back in about a little over a decade ago now, I was working on a case defending the top two election. I worked for a large law firm. Our client was the Grange, which is the nonpartisan civic organization that sponsored the initiative that created the top two. And they were also the organization that had originally sponsored the initiative that created Washington's open primary, which was declared unconstitutional in 2004. And so we were representing, I wasn't the lead attorney, of course, but I was one of the attorneys on the case. And so we were defending the top two. So the top two was created by initiative. And what it does is previously, I'll start with what the open primary was. Washington had an open primary, which meant that you could vote in the primary for different parties for different races. So you could vote for Democrat for governor and, Republican for attorney general or whatever. That was declared unconstitutional. So the top two radically changed the entire election process. Instead of having a normal primary that nominated candidates to then appear on the general election ballot, it creates a two-stage general election where the first election, referred to as the primary, is a winnowing primary where all of the candidates appear on one ballot. Voters simply got one ballot. They could vote for whoever they wanted for each party. And then the top two vote getters moved on to the second stage, to the general election, and appeared on that ballot. Washington, the innovation that the top two had was it also allowed individuals to state their party preference on the ballot, and that would appear on the ballot. So while instead of having a D or an R next to your name, it says prefers Democrats, prefers Republicans, or prefers Libertarians. So I think that's generally the description of the top two. It is, though, it was challenged. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court held that it was constitutional, of course. They held that it didn't invade the party's rights because the parties simply were not part of the election process anymore, as far as they didn't play any official role. And so it was merely a statement of what a person prefers. And the court held there was no ability to stop someone from saying what party they preferred in it.
Okay, I actually, a bunch of different, because I don't live in a top two state, obviously. And a bunch of different things, I should have brought a pen and paper, actually entered my mind hearing your explanation because it brought all kinds of other questions to mind. So in Washington, there is not partisan registration, or there is?
I think you can register for a party. The only time I was registered for a party was in 2012 because I wanted to caucus for Ron Paul, so I had become a Republican, but I didn't. My registration was simply done when I showed up at the caucus site and said I wanted to be a Republican, and then they let me caucus. So if there is official registration, it doesn't serve any purpose as far as the law goes.
Okay, because I didn't think there was. I used to be regional representative. Washington was one of my states, and I didn't think it did have partisan registration, which is right off the bat very foreign to me because I used to live in Florida and now live in Colorado, and I just used to assume that was the way it was everywhere. You always registered, and it's weird when you find out each state can be so different. Okay, excuse me, I do have this cough. I'm not laughing, it's a cough.
No worries.
Yeah. First I want to acknowledge Stephen Ecker because I am wearing my Fox Valley. It's a Wisconsin affiliate shirt. They gave it to me when I was in Wisconsin. Wisconsin was such an awesome state. Was just there recently, so I'm glad that it was noticed. Okay, so it almost sounds to me like it's not really a primary. I think calling it a primary is somewhat of a misnomer. The way you described it as like a two-stage election seems a lot more accurate.
Yeah, it still gets referred to as a primary. I think it may even be called a primary, but in the courts, especially in the Ninth Circuit decision after the remand from the Supreme Court, or the second challenge, I guess it wasn't a remand, it was a separate case. The Ninth Circuit even referred it to a two-stage primary, a two-stage general election. But that was certainly the way we conceived of it and defended it, especially on the ballot access issue, was to say that it is a two-stage general election, and therefore we have basically, to get on the first stage of the election, it's a very low bar. It's either just simply pay the fee, which is 1% of the salary of the position you're running for, or you get a certain number of signatures that's fairly low. So it's extremely wide open there for the first stage.
Okay,
yeah,
now
it is very different. It is a very different, the entire process is very different from normal elections.
Okay, well, you've accomplished one thing here. I'm not saying that my opinion has changed, but my opinion has in one way changed. In not viewing it as a primary, some of the strong noxiousness that I had felt kind of disappears, because making it a two-stage general election is conceiving of it in an entirely different way. And some of the objections I have probably don't have so much to do with the top two itself, but with the underlying process of candidates not being chosen by the political party themselves. And that is something separate and apart from top two itself. That's a separate objection, because I could see something like a two-stage election happening even in a state in which the candidates for the one party are narrowed down to one, and then they're all put on one first stage, and then you get down to two. So if I'm understanding correctly, now correct me if I'm wrong, so for example, and I'm just going to make up an election because I don't want to use specific for dog catcher. You could have 5 people who decide to declare for the Libertarian Party because they
Correct.
prefer Libertarian.
Correct.
So the candidates don't get nominated at the Libertarian Convention. Am I correct there?
The Libertarian Convention is still permitted to nominate their own candidate, but that nomination does not have any relevance to the law. I think that the first thing that I think that is good about the top 2 is it completely ends all the subsidies to the political parties in the election process. They no longer can use state resources or have to use state resources to nominate their candidate. That's done however they choose. And previously, the parties were forced to use the election process to nominate their candidate if they're a major party, and obviously if they're a minor party, they could do it in their convention. But now, they're just the government is the 2-stage process plays no role in the nomination process of the parties, and it ends all the subsidies to the parties, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the D's and R's particularly didn't like it. It also, ends the the government expenditure on the promotion of the parties, because now on the ballot, when people see prefer Democrat, prefer Republican, they can't assume that this is their nominee at all. It's just completely out of it. Now the parties can say like in the voter pamphlet, they can say they're the nominee of so-and-so party, but the government just isn't subsidizing any of that process and is completely out of it.
Yeah, and that's, to me, particularly objectionable that when there's an actual primary that's used to determine the nominee, it's like, that's a private organization. You shouldn't be paying for that. Though I like to remind people, because this happened in Colorado where we went from a caucus state to a primary state, it got forced on the Republicans. It isn't like they wanted to use state funds to choose their nominee. Colorado is forcing them to. So I don't know the history of primaries in every single state, but knowing that in Colorado, it kind of diffused some of the blame I used to put at least on the parties themselves, because here at least the Democrats wanted it, so I'm fully blaming them. But the Republicans fought it and lost. And minor parties were allowed to opt out, which we in fact do. There's some certain circumstances where we're forced into a primary, but it's very rare. It's like once every 15 years or so. And you answered a question I had. So a candidate, if it was the quote unquote official nominee, could use that in their advertising material, their campaign material, to say, I've got the stamp of approval from X. But it would have no bearing on whether or not they were listed, and it gives them no preference on the ballot.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. One of the complaints the parties had in the second lawsuit, which went up to the Ninth Circuit in 2011, is the Democrats were complaining because they found 2 elections where their nominee didn't make it to the general. Some other person who preferred Democrat made it, and they were very sour about that.
And I can understand that. So it's funny because I'm now commiserating with the Democrats a bit, because I can envision, I still have a problem with the parties not choosing their nominee. Though, I don't think that's inherent to the system you're proposing. Again, it would work just as well if it was just a field of people chosen by the particular political parties as well, correct?
No, and the parties still get to choose their nominee. It just, that being chosen as the nominee has no impact on the election, the government-sponsored election process.
No, I get it. But what I'm saying is, let's pretend there was partisan registration and the party got to choose their nominee. The same sort of system could be where there's just one from each of the parties in this 2-stage thing. Like, the concept would still remain the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, because the history of it, so we look to so Louisiana has nonpartisan elections because, being a southern state, only Democrats ever got elected for many years, so they just got rid of the party, the process, and they just have a 2-stage election without any partisan nomination, I guess. But you could do it in a variety of ways, but yeah, it's definitely it definitely hurts all of the parties. There was it was interesting in the lawsuit. We had the Libertarians, the Republicans, and the Democrats all on the same side. So
Yeah, I don't like the idea, just personally, and again, this is separate and apart from the top two thing, of someone being able to use a brand name, so, as it were, and they can completely misrepresent the brand. I think the party has a stake in maintaining its identity, but then again, that's separate and apart, and I know other states have that even without the whole top two thing, that's a separate issue. JJ had a question that I was going to ask, but I'm going to put it up on the screen here. He asked, how is this different from what's called a jungle primary, like in California?
Well, so there's a couple differences. First, the term jungle primary gets used for both Washington and California, and it isn't the worst descriptor. We will see, especially for things like Senator, Congress. Senator, you have 20 people on the primary. So there are some significant differences between California and Washington. First, California has its primary, or the first stage of this election, in June, where Washington has it in August. And that really, I think that makes a difference because, by August, it's easy to think you're in election season, but in June, you're not in election season. So the profile of the election is much lower. And then in California, my understanding is if you want to, in order to list your party preference, it has to be a recognized party. Otherwise, you're listed as, no party preference, or it's left blank. And whereas in Washington, you don't have to be a recognized party to list it as your party preference. You can put whatever you want. So we get some pretty creative things that candidates will say what party they prefer. But so that means in California, to be a recognized party, you have to have a certain amount of ballot success or a certain volume of membership. And so that can be very limiting to you, and that's not a problem in Washington because you don't have to have any showing in order to list your party preference. Okay,
now to talk more about how it affects third parties in general, I could see it diluting, though, the Libertarian vote because it's not winnowed down by the parties themselves to one candidate to carry their banner. So if you had 5 people that said preferred Libertarian, you're splitting an already limited pie many different ways. Again, that's not inherent to the top 2, but it is the way it is in Washington. So am I misunderstanding something there?
Not at all. I think that's definitely, the most legitimate of the criticisms is that you don't have any way of knowing as a voter, you don't have any way of knowing if you're just looking at the ballot, you don't know, what the relationship is, and you can't have multiple people. And so that's, I think that's an issue. I think my response to that, though, is, again, if we want to get government as much out of all of this process as possible, having the government, if the label on the ballot, means something, it means government subsidizing this advertising for the parties, whereas here it's, the parties are left free, and the onus is on them to, inform the public about who they support and who they don't support. I think that's but yeah, I mean, you get crowded ballots with multiple people claiming preference of the same party, and
somebody with more power or money could get people to do that on purpose to dilute. I'm always thinking of how bad actors. I could picture if a Republican felt particularly threatened by, I'm just picking on Republicans today for some reason, because it could be a Democrat just as easy. Yeah, felt threatened by that a Libertarian might beat a spread or whatever like that, could just get a couple of their cronies to put preferred Libertarian to try to dilute the threat.
Yeah, I mean, certainly can happen. I mean, anecdotally, we've seen attempts to try and dilute, and, if you can respond to it with your own, public outreach, you can dispel that. But I also think it's just a matter of, what are the values here? Is it legitimate to have government, propping up the parties by giving them this, labeling them as the official party or not, or is it better to allow the people to make their own decisions about and educate themselves about who is the real party? Because if you're a staunch libertarian, you're going to have no problem finding out who the party nominee is. And so I think putting it on the people to figure out and educate themselves is, I think is preferable than having, relying on the government subsidies to, promote the parties that way. But yeah, there's definitely the risk. And obviously in politics with money, money talks, and they're certainly open to that.
What would you think? I know this isn't the case, but I'm thinking of a way to mitigate against that somewhat, that if the system you're describing was used along with ranked choice, so that people could rank all of the libertarians, like if there was 5 libertarians as their first 5. And it seems that would mitigate a bit against that sort of tactic.
Well, I think ranked choice would be infinitely superior to top 2. I think top 2...
But what about in combination?
Well, I don't. That could work. That's Alaska's got an odd connection of that. They do a top 4, and then ranked choice in the second stage of the general election, which is interesting. But and I don't think they do ranked choice on the first stage, but I could be wrong about that. But yeah, I think that would be good. I think the ranked choice voting is just a completely superior process in any stage of it. Because it encompasses what I see as the real potential benefit of the top 2. I look at the top 2 as kind of a ranked choice light process. So, but yeah, so I think ranked choice is superior every way around it. But yeah, it could be combined with the top 2, and that could be good too.
Yeah, and I was thinking more of it in the first stage rather than the second stage. Because in the second stage, when you're down to just 2...
Yeah, if you've limited it down to 2, I guess there's no point.
Yeah, I could see with 4. Now, you said, Alaska had the top 4. But just statistically speaking, though, honestly, some libertarians get really mad at me with some things I say on this type of topic. Like, I've had people say, ranked choice statistically isn't good for libertarians, so you shouldn't support it. And I don't only support things because I think they're going to benefit the Libertarian Party. I support them if I think they're more just. I'm not trying to rig the system the other way. I don't like the rigging. So the fact that some people go, well, libertarians statistically don't do better in ranked choice, then I go, well, too bad for us. It's a more fair voting system. And unfortunately, though, it surprises me that a lot of libertarians don't find that persuasive. It's like, well, we want to rig it in our favor, and that kind of disgusts me as well.
One of the reasons I like you is that you have your principles and you stand by them.
I appreciate that. So statistically, good, bad, or ugly, how have libertarians done compared to a more typical with an actual primary? Now I'm not liking calling it a primary at all. That's not a primary what you guys have. How statistically do they do in Washington? They
have not fared well. As far as I can tell, we've had, at least according to, is it Wagner? Is that the ballot access?
It's Richard Winger.
According to him, there haven't been libertarians that have made it to the second stage in elections where there were both Republicans and Democrats running. I know there has been at least one libertarian in a congressional race that made it to the second stage, but I couldn't tell if the third place person was an independent, labeled independent, so I don't know if there was even a Republican running in that race. But I think it's in looking at statistics, it's at least if you compare to the Libertarian success in Washington prior to the top 2, it was under the open primary. And that was, once that was declared unconstitutional, we only had, I think, 1 or 2 elections under a non-top 2, non-open primary, or blanket primary. I'm sorry, I'm confusing my terms. blanket primary is what Washington used to have. Open just means you don't have to choose a party.
Right.
You don't have to be registered on the party, but you still have to choose a party ballot. Blanket is what Washington had, and that was what was declared unconstitutional. The Libertarians had a lot of success under the blanket primary, but that was, I think, in part because there was a blanket primary and people didn't have to choose a ballot. And so I don't think they were going to fare as well in the long run under just an open primary system as opposed to blanket. But under the top two, they have not fared particularly well. I think they had established themselves under the blanket primary as what was in Washington called a major party. So they were getting on the general ballot automatically a fair amount of time and had to use the primary to select their nominee, which is the trade-off under the other system.
Right.
So I think that's definitely the biggest hit on the top two is, if you look at statistically, it has not been successful. But I also have not seen the Libertarians embrace the top two, because I think the benefits of it come from the same things as ranked choice voting, the ability to say, to voters, if you really, I guess let me back up a minute. I think a lot of voters will vote for basically against a candidate, the lesser of two evils. They'll choose their Democrat or their Republican because they hate the other party. And so the top two allows them to say, well, in this first round, vote for the candidate you really want, i.e. the Libertarians, and you'll still have the ability to vote against the bad person, try and build the coalition there. And I think because the first stage does have lower voter turnout, I think it's also susceptible to well-motivated voters. And so I think the opportunity for Libertarians is to really get motivated at the first stage where they've got lower voter turnout, where you can make an appeal. In Washington, you appeal to the Eastern Washington folks who all vote Republican and say, hey, if you're Libertarian at heart, in the first stage, vote this, and you'll still get a vote, against the Democrat in the second stage. And that's the opportunity I see. And because it functions similar to the ranked choice voting, it's just delayed or a slower process.
And that was the other question I had. What's the difference in voter turnout? So you said yours, the first stage, I got to ditch the word primary, is in August.
Yeah, and I don't have the stats on it, but when I've looked at it in the past, at least my impression is it's very similar to most primaries in most states. It's a much lower turnout. But I think that is part of the opportunity for the Libertarians is to get their supporters motivated for that at that primary process where they can have a bigger impact. And then, so that's the hope of it. And that's where I at least see the opportunity of it.
And I have a question, and this could be, you might not know the answer, and this could be something better directed to election officials. Is there no reason why they couldn't even be closer together?
I don't see, there may be some mechanics involved for that level of delay, but I don't see anything legally that would prohibit that. I think currently the split has a lot to do just with inertia and just how things have always been. But there may be something to do with ballot printing and such. But I think they could be closer together, and that would be better. But at least it is in August, so it is at least, I think it is part of election season at that time.
Yeah, and I didn't even realize it was that late. So I'm waiting to see if anyone else has any questions. But you actually may have succeeded in what you were trying to do. Not saying you completely changed, but you changed my view of what it actually was. I did not envision it as a two-stage thing. So I definitely did get an education of some things that I need to think about, because now I'm starting to see some benefits where I didn't see absolutely any before. So I think you can count a little bit of a win in educating that said, oh, okay. Because I was envisioning it a whole lot different. It's very hard for someone who hasn't experienced a certain type of system and has only experienced one kind your whole life to even think of anything differently. How often, and this is just now out of curiosity, how often does it happen that it's two people from the same party that end up in the general? I mean, the second stage of the general.
Yeah, so, I don't have the statistics on it, but it does happen fairly frequently. I can tell you in 2018, in the second stage of the general election ballot for the state representatives, so the state Senate and the state House, there was not a single Republican candidate on it for my ballot. It definitely happens. That's the only time it's ever happened to me that I've had no ability to vote for a Republican if I had wanted to, but it definitely happens. And in some places, it makes a lot more sense. When you're talking Seattle, there's no point in having a Republican there. And that was one of the places where the Libertarians would see more success. They'd never have a chance of winning, but because it's such an anti-Republican place. So I'm sure that's pretty common now for Seattle. I live in the suburbs of Seattle that are more conservative than Seattle. So we still generally have a good, both parties are for show, but it definitely happens that you see it.
See one benefit in the second stage is that someone actually has to have a majority. Rather than just a mere plurality, because I don't like elections by plurality at all.
Yeah, you definitely get a very concrete winner. It's always going to be a majority, and that's interesting. I read today on this. Maine actually has something in their state constitution that prohibits election by majority. It requires election by plurality, and that's why they found that the top two didn't. I mean, the ranked choice doesn't work there. That's
interesting.
Yeah, I just read it in an article, so I didn't actually go look at the statutes, so I'm not positive.
That's interesting because isn't, like, if you're looking at the Venn diagram of the sets, isn't a majority a subset of a plurality? I mean, someone who gets a majority did get a plurality. They got a majority.
Yeah, I did find, all I did is, as I said, I just read an article, and that was the way they described it. I was a little confused by it because I was thinking, well, the majority vote getter wins, but for whatever process, they basically, at least according to this article, prohibit the type of top two winnowing that Washington, California, and Louisiana have.
That's kind of weird to me. And just for people, because I didn't know this before I got involved in the LP, the difference between a majority and a plurality. A majority is like, everyone understands a majority. But a plurality is what you see, where someone will win because there's, 3-4 candidates on the ballot, and it's the person who gets the most number. But that could be 33%, 34%. It's usually more than that. It's usually in the 40s, but it's not over 50 a lot of the times.
And that was what was confusing about this article, because it would be, I'm sure whatever the Maine Constitution says, it doesn't say that you can't win if you get 51% of the vote.
Right, because that'd be kind of weird.
Something to the effect of you can't limit it to just two candidates.
Got it. Yeah, because that'd be weird. Like, nope, you can't win. You got too many votes.
Yeah.
All right, and
that is
everyone.
An important part, though. Actually, just one other thing on Washington law, for my completeness, is in the first stage, even if you got over 50%, you would not win. That always goes to the second stage. So that's just
okay. That's interesting as well. All right, everyone in comments, though, if you have any, I'm more than glad to put them up if you have any. But I bet you a lot of people understand a lot better now than before. I certainly did. And I wasn't prepared to. I was prepared to be biting your face off right now. How dare you be reasonable?
I don't think we come to that. I think I'm too much of a fan to do that. To put us in that.
Oh boy, this coughing is just getting to me so bad. And I'm just giving there any some opportunity. But I think we covered it pretty well. And I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on this or any related topics while we're seeing if anyone else has any further questions. And now I'm thinking in the back of my head that I need to do a show in the future about the different kinds of primaries, the closed, the semi-open, because there's like a million different types of actual types of primaries.
And it's there's a lot of states experimenting with it right now. I think since Washington did this, there's just been a flowering of it. I'm not saying it's Washington that caused it, but obviously ranked choice voting is getting experimented in a lot of places. There's been California adopted something similar to Washington, but then 2 other states have rejected it. And then Alaska has its own funky top 4 thing, which I need to look more into, but I find that fascinating. I like that because I do think that the top 2, there is a benefit to being on that, the second stage of the ballot and limiting it to two parties. It just is limited, and I'd like to have more choice as a voter at that stage. And I also think we benefit from having, more voices in the full active campaign. And so this kind of cuts off everybody's campaign at the first stage, except for those 2 parties. So
yeah, I'd be very interested in hearing more about that top 4 things. Now, JJ had a comment, but I think this is true already, but I'll just let you give your first reaction. I'm going to put it up here. JJ says, and just an FYI, if you didn't know, JJ's the parliamentarian who saved my ass in the 2 potential suspension motions on the LNC. So he's my hero right now. So JJ says this could very easily lead to one-party rule in some districts.
Oh, yeah. It is that's definitely a real possibility. And for, as I said, the Seattle area, especially, the Seattle folks are simply one party. And Washington, maybe this should be a sign of problems with the top 2, but Washington right now is a one-party state. We have the governor and both houses are controlled by the Democrats, and that's a big change. Washington generally has been, not had that issue. It's generally been very split. We've had Republican governors, although it's been a long time since we had a Republican governor, but the 2 houses have been either split or Republican for most of the time. But now, I don't know if it's the last 4 years or 6 years, it's been just all Democrats.
Colorado's turned blue. We got hit by the blue wave and we're completely controlled now. But I don't see how this would be any different than a typical system. In some areas where you have a Republican on the ballot, they're just a token. Like, the Democrats are going to win. To me, in an area where the Republican would be a token anyway, I like seeing the competition between 2 Democrats. To me, that might be moderating, where some of your more radical socialist type Democrats would have a hard time if they were running in a top 2 against a more centrist type Democrat.
And I agree with that too. I think there's benefit if you live in Seattle and you're only going to vote for a Democrat anyways, might as well have a choice between a couple Democrats. I read one study or an article about one study that was saying that Washington has not had the moderating effect, but California has had more of a moderating effect by the top 2 process. So that really doesn't tell us too much with the 2 opposite conclusions. But
well, I think it could potentially have that. A lot will depend on the demographics. Seattle's very radical to begin with. It could actually have the opposite, but I could see how it could have a moderating effect.
Yeah. That was certainly the way it was sold.
Well, as a potential. I think ranked choice has that potential as well, because you can't be alienating everybody else because you want their second place or third place. You can't be calling everyone who doesn't support you an idiot. You got to kind of make friends with everybody to the extent possible. And JJ did say, well, it would give them an alternative. And if you're in an area that is so solidly blue or red, whatever, I see an advantage to having 2 choices from the same party.
Yeah. And that was certainly the philosophy in Louisiana to their process too, because, being a southern state, forever they were just all Democrat. There was no point in having Republicans on the ballot. And it's, in some of these districts now, you see the primary decides the election. That's how the AOC got elected, was, just stacking the primary when there's very low voter turnout. And then, of course, she's going to be elected in the general. So I think it has that advantage for places that are dominated
by one or the other. Right.
But I think there's also the other thing with ranked choice voting, and this is the ability to to at least potentially persuade people who may be sympathetic to a third-party candidate but doesn't want to waste their vote, and just convincing them that at the first stage of the primary you're not wasting your vote because you still get a vote against whoever you don't like in the second stage, but this is your opportunity to vote who you really want. And Washington has always had a very strong libertarian undercurrent, even in Democrat. I mean, I come from the Democratic side of things, and it was very easy to become a libertarian because I had the anti-war and civil
Right.
libertarian views and such, and I just had to learn about property rights, and it was a pretty easy transition. But I think you see a lot of that in Washington, and I think that's why the Libertarian Party was more successful under the blanket, because they would get a lot of sympathetic votes. But I think at this stage, the goal would be to just mobilize libertarians to focus on that first stage, and do outreach to sympathetic D's or R's in that first stage, with the sell being you still can vote against who you don't like in the second stage.
And potentially with ranked choice voting as well, because I'm really big, as you can tell, on ranked choice voting. I'm actually active with the group here in Colorado, Ranked Choice Colorado, in trying to bring that. I'm actually going to be petitioning in Castle Rock probably next year to try to get it. What they found successful, just kind of on a side note, because I will always segue into ranked choice when possible, is in Boulder it just got passed for their town council or city council, whatever they call it there, but just for one race, for the mayor, for the one race that everyone votes in rather than just their district representatives. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to try here in Castle Rock as well, because it's not quite so scary to sell the voters on trying it in just one race. And if that works, then you can try to expand it out. So we'll probably be petitioning in Castle Rock for that next year. But I might also be running for town council in Castle Rock, so that's going to be a fun year.
That'll be exciting.
Yeah, and the national
Do you know
convention.
much about the Australians' voting system?
No,
on how they do
don't.
it? They have some type of ranked choice thing, but it's more complicated. I'm curious. Maybe if you do a show on different voting systems, you invite me on. I'll study up on it because it's.
Well, they have proportional as well, I believe, don't they?
Yeah, they have. It's proportional, but they have some type of ranking because. I just remember in their last election, it was all talk about how, we got to wait and see how the second round of doing it is. And
I had no idea. I'm so provincial. I'm a typical American who's so ignorant of everything that goes on anywhere else. And it's so surprising when you talk to somebody overseas how much they know about American politics. And you're like, I know shit about your country. It really is. I say that to our shame, because it is really a type of American arrogance. But I'm really interested in learning more about proportional, too, because I tend to think proportional and ranked choice is what's going to, if we're going to keep this country at all together, the way it is now, we're headed for a big divorce. And like even divorces between people, they end up being very, very messy. And with countries, it tends to be violent. And that's not nice. And I'd like to avoid that at all costs. So I think we desperately need voting reform, or we're looking at a not pleasant future.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think we need that and better voter security. Washington is an entirely mail-in voting state.
So is Colorado, but we've been doing it I think we're one of the first states to do that, so it's kind of down to a science here.
We've been doing it for a long time now too, and it definitely functions well. I just, it's more the security measures of it that's of interest. And I think we prohibit ballot harvesting, so that's good. But I just have concerns about the integrity of it, especially with California and their ballot harvesting practices.
I'm pretty sure that's prohibited in Colorado too, but to be honest with you, I don't know. I haven't really lived here that long, and not through many every 4-year cycles. I haven't been here through 2 presidentials, or have I? Or just barely? I think like on the cusp of two presidentials. So that's interesting. So I think we've got it. I have something I want to ask you about after the show. having to do with the whole New Hampshire. If you've been have you been following what's going on with the LNC with that? Because I have
Yes.
Okay, I have a question for you. It's like on the legal end, and you could tell me if you can't answer or whatever. But all right, everyone. And Kate said you were a great guest, and yes, you did give us a lot to think about. Certainly me. You have changed my perspective. So let me do the outro, and I'll talk with you once I hit end broadcast.
Okay.
Thank you
I'll
so
stay here.
much for appearing.
And thank you for having me on so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, here we go.
What you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business.